Hi friends, I am Professor Kshitij Bansal. I teach law at Jindal Global Law School, and the module we are going to discuss today is International Law and Policy, Right to Water. Let us do an overview of this module to begin with. Every individual possesses a basic need to use water, and it's necessary to survive, and hence every individual has a right to water. Water is the essence of life. Safe drinking water and sanitation are indispensable to sustain life and health, and they are fundamental to the dignity of all. Yet 884 million people do not have access to improved sources of drinking water. This module shall provide a brief overview of the right to water under international law and the legal instruments that recognize sanitation as a basic human right. This module on right to water in international law will mainly focus on the status of right to water on an international platform. This module provides a brief about all the important international conventions, treaties and resolutions which have contributed in the recognition of the right to water at the international level. This module will also put light on the key events and resolution which played a significant role in determining right to water as a basic human right. What will you be learning after this briefing? The main objective of this module is to understand the legal instruments that recognize right to water as a basic human right. This module intends to deliver a brief overview about the various important regulations with regard to right to water on the international framework. This module shall cover all the important legislations and events that have made a significant effect on the right to water. Let us begin our discussion. The right to water and sanitation is now recognized at international level as a right as well. The United Nations General Assembly perceived in the 1977 Mar del Plata Action Plan that irrespective to the level of monetary improvement or economic upliftment, all people have the right to have access to drinking water in quantities and of a quality equal to their basic needs. There are several conventions, treaties, policies, resolutions that determine the right to water and sanitation. Resolutions are generally adopted by bodies comprised of governments, with the exception of UN Subcommission on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, formerly known as the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Human Rights, and some other bodies that are composed of independent experts acting in their personal capacity. Despite the recognition of water as a human right, figures of individuals deprived of basic right to water is very high in the developing and underdeveloped countries. There is a lack of intent and infrastructure on the part of the nation states and is a big concern at the international level. The recognition of the right to water and sanitation at the international level gave a boost to the formation of an international law and policy framework. The existence of the right to water and sanitation in international treaties was affirmed. Resolutions were passed for the right to water and sanitation to be an explicit right in the international law area. International conventions and treaties. Let us talk about them. General Comment number 15 was adopted by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights at its 29th session in November 2002 on the right to water. The comment provides guidelines for states on the interpretation of the right to water under two articles of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Article 11, the right to an adequate standard of living, and Article 12, which is the right to health. The legal basis of the right to water. The human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. An adequate amount of safe water is necessary to prevent death from dehydration, reduce the risk of water-related diseases, and to provide for consumption, cooking, personal and domestic hygienic requirements. While the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights does not explicitly refer to the right to water, the committee underlined that the right to water was a part of the right to an adequate standard of living, as were the rights to adequate food, housing and clothing. Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation based on free consent. Article 11 of this covenant created a lot of controversy because it states the term including. It was critiqued that the term including refers to merely a part and it was not exhaustive in nature. Since water is the most basic need and is vital for an individual to survive, right to water clearly falls within the category of guarantees essential for securing an adequate standard of living, particularly since it is one of the most fundamental conditions for survival. The judicial systems in the countries also are now influenced by the General Comment 15 to safeguard the human right. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW as we popularly call it, is one of the most important instruments that explicitly talks about water and sanitation. Article 14, Clause 2 of CEDAW recognizes the right to water and sanitation. The article stipulates that states parties shall ensure to women that right to enjoy adequate living conditions, particularly in relation to water supply. Article 14 of CEDAW says, state parties shall take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in rural areas in order to ensure on a basis of equality of men and women that they participate in and benefit from rural development, and in particular shall ensure to such women the right to enjoy adequate living conditions, particularly in relation to housing, sanitation, electricity and water supply, transport and communications. Article 14, Clause 2H is one of the few instances where conventions explicitly affirms the right to water and sanitation. According to this article, the state parties shall have to ensure and provide the women with adequate living conditions, especially in relation to housing, sanitation, electricity, water supply, transport and communication. The Convention on the Rights of Child 1989, popularly called the CRC of 1989, also explicitly mentions about the right to water, and its Article 24 provides us with the right to water, and it states as follows. State parties shall pursue full implementation of this right and in particular shall take appropriate measures to combat disease and malnutrition, including within the framework of primary health care through inter alia the application of readily available technology and through the provisions of adequate nutritious foods and clean drinking water, taking into account the dangers and risks of environmental pollution. This convention is the second explicit reference to the right to water. Article 24 gives the child the right to health, placing the obligation upon the state to implement this right, especially through appropriate measures to combat disease and malnutrition, through the provision of adequate nutritious food and clean drinking water. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child underlined that under Article 24, states have the responsibility to ensure access to clean drinking water, and that such access is particularly essential for young children's health. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006 is the next instrument which we would talk about. This convention dealing with the rights of persons with disabilities is a legally enforceable treaty, putting an obligation on the states to provide people with disabilities with certain guaranteed rights. It is an important convention explicitly stating the human right to water in its Article 28, which states that state parties shall recognize the rights of persons with disabilities to social protection and to the enjoyment of that right without discrimination on the basis of disability, and shall take appropriate steps to safeguard and promote realization of this right, including measures to ensure equal access by persons with disabilities to clean water services and to ensure access to appropriate and affordable services, devices and other assistance for disability related needs. Article 28 defines the right of persons with disabilities to an adequate standard of living, including social protection, obligating states to ensure equal access by persons with disabilities to clean water services. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 28 gives the people with disabilities the right to an adequate standard of living, including food, water, clothing, housing, and effective social protection, including poverty reduction and public housing programs. United Nations resolutions are another set of instruments we would talk about. Human Rights Council Decision 2/104. United Nations Human Rights Council in 2006 passed a Decision 2/104, Human Rights and Access to Water. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in his 2007 report affirmed that it is now time to consider access to safe drinking water and sanitation as a human right, defined as the right to equal and non-discriminatory access to a sufficient amount of safe drinking water for personal and domestic uses to sustain life and health. Secondly, let's talk about Human Rights Council Resolution 7/22. In order to address to human rights issue, Resolution 7/22 was passed by Human Rights Council. It was found that there is a need of an expert to be present, and the primary job of this expert was to identify, promote and exchange views and best practices related to access to safe drinking water and sanitation. General Assembly Resolution 64/292 is the third UN document that we would discuss. The General Assembly officially recognized the right to water and sanitation on 28th July 2010 by supporting a resolution. The Resolution 64/292 acknowledges that clean drinking water and sanitation are integral to the realization of all human rights. The resolution also calls upon states and international organizations to provide financial resources, help build capacity and transfer technology to help other countries, especially developing and the underdeveloped ones, to provide safe, clean, accessible and affordable drinking water and sanitation for all. fourth document that we would talk about is Human Rights Council Resolution 15/9. The United Nations General Assembly passed the decision 15/9, consequently affirming that the human right to water and sanitation is consistent with existing international human rights law as a derivative right of the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, as well as the right to life and human dignity. Human Rights Resolution 21/2. It was in this resolution for the first time that all the nation states accepted the reaffirmation that right to water and sanitation are brought down from the right to an adequate standard of living. Human Rights Resolution 24/18. This resolution confirmed the recognition of the rights to water and sanitation. The resolution listed down all the normative content categories of the rights to water and sanitation. Catarina de Albuquerque was appointed as independent expert in 2008 following the passage of this particular resolution. Next UN resolution is the Human Rights Council Resolution 16/2. This resolution essentially extended the tenure of the independent expert by 3 years and urged her to promote the full realization of the right to water and sanitation. General Assembly Resolution 68/157. The resolution of 68/157 is the latest resolution adopted by the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. This resolution reaffirmed that the human right to water and sanitation is derived from the right to adequate standard of living. Article 2 Clause 1, Article 6 Clause 1 and Article 26 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the year 1966, Article 1 Clause 2, Article 2, Article 11, Article 12 of International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, Article 2 and Article 5 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination 1965 are few examples of the conventions which implicitly recognize the human right to water and sanitation. It would be fine to conclude on this discussion of right to water in international law by recalling that we discussed the positioning of right to water as an explicit or an implicit right in various legal treaties and documents and UN resolutions. This module provided a brief overview of all of these legal instruments and how they recognize access to water and sanitation as a basic human right. Let us recall that these instruments were Convention on the Rights of Child, ICCPR 66, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006, and some very important UN resolutions by Human Rights Council and UN General Assembly. These various instruments and resolutions throw light on the different aspects of right to water as well, which are relevant to people with different kinds of vulnerabilities, for example, disability or children or women. I hope this was informative. Thank you so much for listening.